All right, this is our second video in a series on alterations to digestive function. So we're going to start today by talking about gastritis. All right, gastritis occurs when there's inflammation of the gastric mucosa. You can either have acute gastritis brought on by something very specific or chronic gastritis, which is an ongoing condition. So it's going to affect the lining of your stomach, essentially. So if you have inflammation, right, when we see the itis, we know that it's inflammation of something. In this case, it's the gastric mucosa. So obviously that inflammation is going to give us pain, but it's going to give you a feeling of fullness because the inflammation is going to create some pressure on the wall of the stomach, and that's going to give an indication that perhaps you feel full even though you're not, right? So accompanying this might be some pain, nausea, and vomiting. So why does someone develop gastritis? Very often it is linked to abuse of alcohol. There are 3 organs that take a hit when you drink heavy amounts of alcohol: your stomach, your liver, and your pancreas. So when we're thinking about treatment for gastritis, we want to treat it first by taking very small, it's not good, small meals, kind of a bland diet. But one of the treatments that we have to include for someone who has gastritis is to avoid alcohol, because alcohol is absorbed right through the wall of your stomach, and so it's going, if you had inflammation in that area, it would perhaps irritate it. And aspirin as well. Okay, so alcohol is going to be a reoccurring theme for the rest of our discussion on digestive issues, because it does impact several different organs when you have chronic excessive intake of alcohol. Okay, so our next issue is peptic ulcers. Okay, so when someone has an ulceration, it's almost like a tear. You can have a buccal ulceration in the mucosal lining of the cheek, for example. So this is an ulceration in that mucosal lining, which is protective in many regards because it's the barrier between the lumen, which is considered the outside world, and the interior space. So it could be, an ulcer can occur in any place, including things like the lower esophagus, the intestines, or the stomach or the duodenum. This can be caused by erosive factors. More often than not, it's bacterial. And the culprit in this case is a bacteria called H. pylori. But it can also be attributed to the use and abuse of NSAIDs. For those who don't know what an NSAID is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. So something like ibuprofen or Motrin is an NSAID. Okay, if someone has a peptic ulcer due to a H. pylori, then obviously the treatment would be an antibiotic as well. Okay, but generally speaking, if someone has an ulcer, they experience epigastric pain, kind of chronically, and then acute pain upon eating. So in some people, there can be bleeding associated with these ulcerations as well. So if it's H. pylori, an antibiotic would be an appropriate treatment. But some of the other things we can layer on top of that would be antacids, proton pump inhibitors, something like Prilosec, okay, which is an acid reducer, or Zantac, which is another type of acid reducer that reduces inflammation as well. And then antacids are really, and when you take an antacid like Tums, what you're doing is neutralizing acid, bringing it closer to a more neutral pH, and so you don't get the damage associated with the more acidic pH. Okay. So then what we want to talk about just briefly is the role of the pancreas, because we're going to talk about issues with absorption. Okay, so the pancreas is famous for its endocrine action. It is an endocrine organ. most people are aware of it because of diabetes, but the endocrine function of the pancreas is to produce insulin and glucagon, which is involved in the control of blood sugar. So we're going to leave that off to the side for the moment. What we want to focus on is its exocrine function. And that is more the digestive function. And in that case, then we want to think about what does the pancreas bring to the table to help facilitate digestion. So 2 things that are of critical importance: bicarbonate and digestive enzymes. And this is what makes up pancreatic juice. All right, so why are these 2 things of critical importance? And then we'll talk about when the exocrine function of the pancreas is insufficient, what the outcomes of that might be. So we want to think about why would bicarbonate be important and what's the enzyme piece. Okay, so let's start with the enzyme piece. That's easy. I had mentioned in the last video, when you're breaking something down, you need to take it from its macro or its larger state to a micro state. And we do that a couple of different ways. We do it mechanically and chemically. The chemical piece is digestive enzymes. In order to break down the various nutrients that you take in, carbs, protein, fats, you need a variety of different enzymes to kind of carry out those tasks, okay? You start the digestion of certain things. I'll use carbs as an example. You start the breakdown of carbs in your mouth, but it's not complete. We need the enzymes coming out of the pancreas to complete the process. So if you don't have pancreatic juice introduced into the digestive process, you will not complete digestion, and therefore you're not really getting at any of the nutrients that you took in. So that's important. And then the other important thing is bicarbonate. Remember, the secretions of your stomach are extremely acidic. The conditions are, pH around 2, right? Your stomach is adapted to that very acidic pH, but nobody else around it is. So when chyme empties from the stomach into the small intestine, it will be immediately greeted by pancreatic juice. The bicarbonate is going to neutralize acid chyme, and by doing so, it can pass through the rest of the small intestine without causing any damage. If you take out the bicarbonate piece, right, if someone has a pancreas that's not functioning properly and they're not releasing the appropriate amount of pancreatic juice, this neutralization process isn't going to happen. And if that doesn't happen, you can cause pretty significant damage to the lining of the small intestine, and over time that's really going to erode the small intestinal wall. All right, so what can cause a decrease in pancreatic enzyme function, which is called pancreatic exocrine insufficiency? So what can cause this to shut down? Okay, so 3 things really can cause a decrease in the exocrine function of the pancreas: pancreatic cancer, pancreatitis, which we're going to cover later, and cystic fibrosis. Some of the outcomes of a reduction in pancreatic exocrine function would be related to some of the things we discussed regarding the enzymes and the bicarbonate function of the pancreas. So, some of the outcomes of this would be you would have a fatty stool. Again, this speaks to the enzyme piece that the exocrine cells of the pancreas are contributing. There is a enzyme called lipase coming out of the pancreas that breaks down fat. Well, if we can't get pancreatic juice introduced into the duodenum, you're not going to have this piece broken down. So now all that fat that you should have broken down is going to wind up in your stool, so you'll have fatty stool. You would have a decrease in the absorption of certain vitamins. So your patient might have a vitamin deficiency, and that's going to be manifested in several different ways depending on which vitamin you're talking about, right? A vitamin C deficiency doesn't look like a vitamin D or a zinc deficiency, right? So we might have vitamin or mineral deficiencies because we have inadequate absorption. And then of course weight loss. And this is one of the key signs that's often misread with pancreatic cancer, is someone will have very rapid and dramatic weight loss, often without intention. If you're not absorbing some of those nutrients because you haven't broken them down completely, then you're not going to be able to put on weight. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about in this video segment is lactose intolerance, which is another malabsorptive issue. All right, so when someone has lactose intolerance, they cannot tolerate lactose. So then the question becomes, what is lactose and why is it a problem? Okay, so first off, what is lactose? It's a sugar. It is a disaccharide. And we remember from AMP1, if something is a disaccharide, it means it's two sugar molecules bonded together. So in this case, it's glucose and galactose bonded together. In order for someone to process lactose, they need an enzyme to cleave the bond between the two saccharides. So that enzyme is called lactase. When you see the ASC ending, oftentimes in biology, that indicates that it's an enzyme. So lactase will break down lactose into its individual monomers, and then that's what can be absorbed. People who are lactose intolerant simply don't have the enzyme. They may have had it at one point, but they don't produce it anymore. Because they don't have the enzyme, when they ingest dairy products, remember lactose is the sugar within dairy products, so when they ingest dairy products, it becomes almost like a digestive irritant because they can't completely process it and break it down. So the outcomes of this would be you have things like gas and bloating and cramping and pain, diarrhea associated with ingesting products that are containing lactose. And this really varies in its severity. Some people, really can only ingest a little bit of dairy and it causes a reaction, and others might have some tolerance or mild tolerance. The treatment for lactose intolerance or sensitivities is that you simply avoid lactose. And avoiding lactose now is much easier than it historically has ever been because there are more lactose-free products on the market and readily available than there were in the past. If not, you can take Lactaid. And when you're taking Lactaid, you're essentially taking the enzyme component that you're lacking so that when you introduce lactose into your system, the enzyme is available to break down lactose. Okay, that's going to do it for malabsorptive issues. When we come back, we're going to talk about inflammatory bowel disease.